I was 34 when my grandfather died. We weren't close, to be honest. He was a reserved, almost cold man who spent most of his time holed up in the study of his Victorian home in Portland. My mother always said he'd been different before, warm and playful, but something had changed in him decades ago. Something no one in the family could explain. The funeral was small and quiet. Just a few elderly neighbors, my mother, myself, and my younger brother Tyler. The family lawyer, a middle-aged man, named Mr. Henriksen, was waiting for us at my grandfather's house 3 days later for the reading of the will. I expected something simple. The house divided between my mother and uncle, perhaps some savings, a few antiques of no real value. But when we walked into the office where my grandfather spent so many hours, I realized something was different. Henriksen adjusted his glasses and opened a worn leather folder. He read the standard portion of the will, the house to my mother, some stocks, to my uncle who lived in Seattle. Then he paused, looked directly at me, and said something that would change everything. To my grandson, James, I leave the complete contents of the safe in the basement, along with the key in his personal envelope. He'll know what to do. My mother looked at me confused. Tyler seemed irritated, probably because he hadn't received anything so mysterious. But me? I was shocked. I hadn't even known my grandfather had a safe. Henriksen handed me a thick envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was an antique iron key, heavy, with ornate details that appeared to have been hand-forged. But there was something else. A letter, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. James, it read, if you're reading this, it means I've finally had the courage to leave this burden to someone else. Forgive me for choosing you, but I've always seen something in your eyes, a curiosity others don't. What's in the safe isn't just mine. It's ours. It's the Whitmore family's. And it comes with a responsibility I've carried alone for too long. Don't open the safe with witnesses. Go alone. Trust your instincts. And remember, some truths are dangerous. My hand was shaking by the time I finished reading. My mother tried to look over my shoulder, but I instinctively folded the letter and put it in my pocket. Something in my grandfather's tone told me he was serious about not having witnesses. I made up some excuse, saying I needed to process everything and that I'd be back to help organize the house the next day. Tyler rolled his eyes. My mother looked hurt, but nodded. I returned to that house at 3 in the morning. Yes, I know how it sounds. But I couldn't wait. Curiosity was consuming me. I used the key my mother had given me to let myself in through the front door. The house was silent, sepulchral. Every creak of the wooden floor echoed like a scream. I descended the stairs to the basement, a place I had visited only once or twice as a child. Always. Accompanied. Always feeling like I shouldn't be there. The basement was exactly as I remembered it. Damp, filled with stacked boxes, furniture covered in ghostly white sheets. But deep inside, behind a dusty bookshelf of old books, was a metal door I'd never noticed before, or maybe I'd never paid attention to it. The lock was old, but when I inserted the key, it turned smoothly, as if it had been used recently. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a small space, almost a secret chamber. In the center was a black safe, the kind you see in old movies, with a combination wheel, but next to it, taped to the wall with yellow duct tape, was an envelope with my name on it. My breath quickened. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was the combination, September 17th, 1943. A date. But for what? I turned the wheel slowly, listening to each click. Right, left, right again. The safe opened with a sigh as if it had been holding its breath for decades. And what I saw inside left me completely still. There were wads of cash, yes, but it wasn't modern currency. They were old bills, some in 50s, some in hundreds, all dated 1940 and 1950. There must have been at least $30,000 or $40,000 in there. But that wasn't even close to the most disturbing thing. There were documents, lots of documents. 3 fake passports, all with my grandfather's photo but different names. Wilhelm Schmidt, Jean Moreau, Thomas Blackwell, all issued between 1945 and 1950. Heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Who was my grandfather? Beneath the passports was an old, worn map of a region I vaguely recognized as southern Germany and northern Austria. There were red markings in several places, notes in German I couldn't understand. And then, deep in the safe, wrapped carefully in black velvet, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a small gold statuette, no bigger than my hand. It depicted an eagle with outspread wings, and at the base was a swastika. I dropped it immediately as if it were burning. My mind began to race. No, it couldn't be. My grandfather couldn't have been a Nazi. That was impossible. He had fought in World War II, my mother always said. He was an American veteran, a hero. But as I stared at the fake passports, the map of Germany, that hideous statuette, a much darker truth began to form in my mind. And then I saw the last item in the safe. A brown leather diary, so old the pages were yellowed and brittle. I opened it to the first page and recognized my grandfather's handwriting, but much younger, firmer. The date was April 15th, 1945. Today was the strangest day of my life, the first entry read. We found a bunker near Berchtesgaden. Our platoon was sent to investigate after intelligence said there might be officers hiding. There were no officers. What was there was much worse, or much better. I still don't know. I continued reading, turning the pages carefully. My grandfather described how his platoon had discovered a secret hiding place full of treasures looted by the Nazis, artwork, jewelry, gold, documents. And he and 3 other soldiers had made a decision in that moment. They hid some of the treasure. They didn't report everything. They took what they could carry and made a pact. They would divide everything after the war. But there had been complications. One of the soldiers, a man named Eddie Kowalski, had died 2 weeks later in combat. Another, Robert Chen, simply disappeared after demobilization. The third, someone my grandfather called only Dutch, had remained in Europe. My grandfather had returned home with his share of the treasure and the guilt. The diary was a tormented record of decades of remorse, fear of discovery, paranoia that someone would come after him. He had sold most of his things over the years using intermediaries, turning stolen art and gold into clean cash that he invested in his quiet life in Portland. But he had kept some things, like the statuette, like the documents, and like the map. Because the map didn't show where things were, it showed where the rest of the treasure was still hidden, the part that was too big to move, too dangerous to touch at the time. My grandfather and Dutch had hidden it again, in a different place, planning to return one day, but they never did. Dutch had died in the 1970s, according to a letter I found among the diary pages, and my grandfather had been left alone with the secret. I sat on the cold basement floor, surrounded by these impossible artifacts. My grandfather, the silent man who barely spoke to me, had been a thief. He had stolen looted treasures, which technically meant he was stealing from thieves, but still. And now he had passed this on to me. Why? What did he expect me to do? I spent the next few hours reading every page of the diary. My grandfather described how the weight of secrecy had destroyed his marriage, alienated his children, and turned him into a recluse. He spoke of nightmares, of the faces of Holocaust victims he imagined were the true owners of these treasures. He wanted to do the right thing, but he was too afraid of the legal consequences. And so he had simply waited to die and pass the burden on to someone else. For me. The last diary entry was from just 2 weeks before his death. I am ill. he wrote. "The doctors say I have only a few months left. It's time to make a decision. I will leave everything to James. He is young, brave, and not stuck in the past like I am. Maybe he can do what I never could. Maybe he can find a way to give everything back without destroying our family. Or maybe he will simply take the money and live his life. Either way, the burden will no longer be mine." I closed the diary and looked around. What the hell was I supposed to do? Call the authorities? Turn everything over to a museum? But how would I explain where it came from? My family would be swept up in the scandal. My mother, who had adored my father despite his eccentricities, would be devastated to learn the truth. And my grandfather? His legacy would be destroyed, remembered not as the quiet veteran, but as a war thief. Or I could simply close the safe, put everything back, and pretend I never saw anything, leave it for the next owner to discover decades from now. Or I could do what a dark part of me was whispering. Take the map, travel to Europe, find the rest of the treasure. It had to be worth millions. I could change my life completely. But as these options swirled in my head, I picked up one of the documents from the safe again. It was a list, written in German but with English translations next to it in my grandfather's handwriting. It listed everything they had found in that bunker, and next to each item, when possible, the name of the Jewish family from whom it had been stolen. My grandfather had done his research. He knew exactly who he had stolen from. There were names I recognized from history books. Entire families had been exterminated, and their treasures, their inheritances, their memories had been stolen twice, once by the Nazis and then by the liberators who should have been the good guys. That's when I made my decision, but not immediately. First, I needed to understand everything. I needed to see the whole map, literally and figuratively. I took all the documents, put them back in the safe, and locked them away. I took only the diary and the list of names with me. I left that house as the sun was beginning to rise, feeling 10 years older. For the next few weeks, I lived a double life. During the day, I helped my mother clean my grandfather's house, smiled at family lunches, and pretended everything was normal. At night, I locked myself in my apartment and researched. I learned about Nazi treasure hunters, about the restitution efforts that were still ongoing, more than 70 years after the war. I learned about art commissions, about international law, about ethical dilemmas. And I learned something else. One of the names on my grandfather's list, a family called Rothstein, still had living descendants. An 82-year-old woman in New York, Sarah Rothstein Goldman, granddaughter of the original owner of some of the pieces. She had spent decades searching for her family's artifacts. There were articles about her, interviews where she talked about keeping the memory alive. It took me 2 months to work up the courage, but I finally called her. My voice trembled as I introduced myself, saying I had information about some of her family's belongings. She was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice that carried decades of pain and hope, she asked, "You found them? After all these years?" We met at a cafe in Manhattan. I had flown there with copies of some of the documents, not the originals yet. I needed to be sure. Sarah was a small, frail woman, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. When I showed her the lists, the descriptions, she began to cry. Silently at first, then in sobs that shook her entire body. "My grandfather hid these things before the Nazis came," she said when she could speak. "He thought he could protect them. But they found everything. They took everything. And then they took him. My grandmother, my uncles, my aunts. My mother only survived because she was hiding with a Christian family." She touched the papers in front of me with trembling fingers. "I thought I would never see even a photo of these things again. And you're telling me they still exist?" I told her the truth. Part of the truth. I said my grandfather had found these things after the war and wasn't sure how to deal with them. I omitted the part about him stealing them, hiding them, living with the dirty blood for decades. I saw no reason to add more pain to her story, but Sarah was clever. She read between the lines. "Was your grandfather one of the liberators?" she asked softly. I nodded. "And he took some things?" I remained silent. She placed her hand in mine. "Young man, I'm not here to judge. War did terrible things to everyone. It turned good people into monsters and monsters into heroes. If your grandfather kept these things for all these years and now you want to return them, then he wasn't a bad man, just a scared man." His words broke me in a way I hadn't expected. I realized I was crying there, in that Manhattan cafe, in front of a stranger who was offering me forgiveness I didn't deserve, but which my grandfather had, desperately needed. I returned to Portland with a mission. I contacted an organization specializing in Holocaust art restitution. I worked with lawyers who assured me that if we did everything correctly, anonymously if possible, my family could be protected from prosecution. It wasn't easy. There were times when I almost gave up, when fear and the lure of money almost won out. But every time I felt that way, I thought of Sarah, of her eyes when she touched those documents. And I thought of my grandfather, locked in that office for decades, a prisoner of his own secret. It took 6 months, but we finally got everything organized. The pieces from the safe were authenticated, documented, and returned through the appropriate channels. Some went to museums, others to descendants like Sarah. The process was handled discreetly. My grandfather's name was never publicly released. He was only described as an American veteran who wished to remain anonymous. As for the map and the treasure, still hidden in Europe, that's a story still being written. Because I went. I flew to Germany 3 months ago. I found the spot marked on the map, a small valley in the Bavarian Alps, and yes, it was still there, hidden in an obscure cave that probably no one had visited in 70 years. But here's the thing. When I looked at those boxes covered in dust and rust, at the gold glinting faintly in the light of my flashlight, I didn't feel greed. I didn't feel excitement. I felt only a deep, deep sadness. Because every piece there had a story. It had belonged to someone who loved, who dreamed, who was taken from the world too soon. So I did what my grandfather should have done 80 years ago. I called the authorities. I reported everything. And now, as I speak to you, these treasures are being cataloged, identified, and returned. My family will never know the whole truth. I protected my grandfather's legacy as best I could. My mother still thinks of him as her distant but decent father. Tyler never knew about the safe. And what about me? I live with the weight of what I know. But it's a weight I can carry. Because unlike my grandfather, I don't have to carry it alone. Sarah called me last week. One of the returned pieces, a silver candelabra, had belonged to her family. It will be displayed in a Holocaust museum with its full history. She invited me to the opening. I will go. And I will think of my grandfather, the frightened young soldier who made a bad decision at an impossible time and lived with the consequences until his last day. This is the mysterious legacy he left me. Not the gold, not the treasures, but the chance to do what he never could. The chance to choose right when it would have been so easy to choose wrong. And I hope, wherever he is, that he can finally rest in peace.